Good afternoon. By way of beginning our webinar, I would like to do an acknowledgement of country. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which our institutions and communities are located and where we conduct our business. We pay deep respect to ancestors and elders, past, present and future. We are committed to honouring First Nation peoples' continuing connection to land, to water and culture. I'm Professor Margaret Ann Carter. I'm a member of the Australasian Mental Health and Higher Education Collaboration Committee. I'm also chair of the counselling discipline with the Australian College of Applied Professions, and I'm an adjunct professor with James Cook University. On behalf of our committee, I would like to welcome you to what we have called a fireside chat, which forms part of our 2021 series entitled The Tapestry of Mental Health in Higher Education. Foundational pillars for mentally healthy workplaces, policies, processes, and strategies are the focus of the conversation with David and Jeremy today. We acknowledge the diversity of workplaces and spaces, different stages of growth, development, different degrees of understanding about mentally healthy workplaces, and different levels of commitment. What does well-being in your workplace or your workspace actually mean to you? To start our fireside conversation, I'd invite you to go into our Zoom chat where we have a Mentimeter link. And if you're comfortable, to click on the link and share what your lived experience, your perceptions are in terms of mentally healthy workplaces and workspaces. We'll come back to that word cloud before we have conversation based on the questions that have been posed through Jeremy and David's conversation in our chat room. So we invite you to engage in this interactive platform. By way of housekeeping, we will record the session so that we can post it on our AMHHEC website. Counsellors are on call with James Cook University and the Australian College of Applied Professions. So please follow up after this webinar if you require a session with one of our counsellors. Throughout the webinar, the chat function is active. We invite commentary and questions via the function during the fireside chat. Our fellow committee member, Dr. Vicky Hutton, is monitoring our chat room, and Vicky will provide a synopsis of comments and of questions to which Jeremy and David will endeavour to respond. I invite our speakers for today, David Lindsay and Jeremy Audas, to introduce themselves and to begin our fireside chat.
Thank you, Margaret, for that wonderful introduction, and welcome to everyone that's joined this last webinar for the year. Wherever you may be, around the world, around Australia, welcome to this fireside chat. As Margaret's indicated, my name's David Lindsay, but I'm an associate professor here within the School of the Disciplines of Nursing and Midwifery at James Cook University here in Townsville, and a member of the AMHHEC committee. I'll hand over to Jeremy just to introduce himself as well.
Thank you, David, and thanks to everyone for joining today's session. I feel quite privileged to be here. I'm Jeremy Audas. I'm an Executive Manager with the Richmond Fellowship Queensland, which is a large, multifaceted mental health organisation delivering a wide range of mental health services in our Queensland communities. However, I'm not speaking on behalf of Richmond Fellowship on this occasion, but rather will be bringing to the fore my 30-odd years experience, mostly in management roles in not-for-profit community services and government.
Thanks, Jeremy. So as we were just listening to Margaret, Claire, who's working very efficiently behind the scenes and managing that Menti word cloud. Thanks, Claire, for putting that up. Claire will be popping reminders in the chat from time to time throughout the webinar. So if anyone misses the opportunity because they've logged in late and so on, they can still, of course, keep adding words to that word cloud, which will keep building, and we'll visit it about halfway through the webinar just to see how that's building. And again, we'll have a look at it at the end of the webinar, and you can keep adding words to that word cloud as new thoughts arise based on perhaps something that Jeremy and I say in our conversation. Please continue to add words to that word cloud, and we'll have a look at it at the end of the webinar and just see the sorts of responses that you've provided about what your sense is of workplace wellness. What does that mean to you in your particular context? So if you can attend to that, that would be great. I think that's a really good opportunity to engage with each other around that particular question. Well, I'm sitting here in tropical North Queensland, and so here in Townsville, it's a nice crisp 33 odd degrees outside, and so this idea of having a fireside chat is a bit antithetical, but here we are. That's what we're going to do. This final webinar for the year really is the culmination of what has been a series of very successful webinars that AMHHEC have held throughout the year. And COVID, like in many other spheres of life, has really been responsible for us going to a virtual presentation like this rather than having a face-to-face conference, which we otherwise would normally do. But they're excellent opportunities to engage with a wide variety of people who otherwise would not have been able to be involved in these sorts of conversations. And so it's a really good opportunity. And so, Jeremy, thank you for your introduction and for being with us today. So let's begin. Jeremy, can you tell us a little bit about the Richmond Fellowship and your role and the Fellowship's role regarding mental health and wellbeing and recovery and support services?
Yes, as I mentioned earlier, we do deliver a wide range of community-based services to people who are in psychological stress or are unwell. Richmond Fellowship is part of the worldwide federation in those fellowships, and it's a highly respected organisation, both here in Queensland and overseas. So our work, like the work across the mental health sector in Australia and many parts of the world, is recovery focused. That is, it's about saying, well, you might have a mental illness, but there is a great future for you with appropriate support and interventions. But you're in charge of your own life. You've got to lead the way.
Thanks, Jeremy. Our focus today, as Margaret indicated in her introduction, is upon three key areas of workplace wellbeing: strategy, policy, and culture. And they form the basis of our discussion today, our conversation. And so what we want to do is unpack them a little bit. So thinking about these three key areas, can you give examples of how each of these might contribute to well-being in the workplace?
Certainly, certainly. So when we're looking at workplaces, modern workplaces, most workplaces and organisations that supervise them have a particular vision or mission that they want to achieve. To achieve that vision or mission, organisations need a strategy. And that strategy must be designed to not only incorporate our external customers and clients and students and so on, but it must also provide strategies that support the staff of the organisation as well. And so that links to the idea of policy. Now, policy development is very important. Policies provide the guardrails around which people can work in an organisational setting. They're also designed to protect the organisation, its staff, and its customers. Now, some of those policies will be related to workplace health and safety, and it's only in recent years that a stronger focus has been put on policies around workplace wellbeing and mental health. So it's a relatively newly developing area, and there's lots of new research emerging around that. And so strategy, policy, and culture. Now, culture is the tricky one because culture is more than strategy, it's more than policy. It's about people and relationships within the organisation, how they get on with one another and how they can support one another. We've all heard of toxic workplaces where there is little support for staff, managers bully their subordinates, and there are few support mechanisms in place. Now, our job is to try to bring about the strategy, the appropriate policies that support it, and develop a culture that supports workplace wellbeing.
So this might be a bit of a rhetorical question then. Which of those three do you think is the most important?
Well, culture.
Yep.
You might have heard the term culture beats strategy, hands down. So you can have a great strategy, wonderful policies, but the culture can be quite bad. And so the organisation and staff aren't going to be in a workplace that encourages wellbeing. On the other hand, you can have a really strong culture, a good, positive culture that embraces everybody's needs in the organisation, and the policy and strategy might be awry. So it's about these things lining up.
So, okay, so we're going to tease that out a little bit further.
Yeah, I think, David, would you like to talk a bit about how that relates to higher education?
Yeah. Yes, and I mean the higher education sector, obviously it's a huge sector in Australia, and it, like every other sphere of work, has undergone substantial change due to COVID, and that's reshaped things like how people work in terms of work from home type options. Certainly for those at the teaching coalface, it's meant they've had to teach differently. In other words, they had to really pivot pretty quickly to move online, and that has had a big impact on staff and students and the systems that support them. So all the professional technical staff, it affected everybody. And so that was a really significant change. And strategy had to, align and be nimble enough to respond to those different circumstances. We needed new policy around supporting students through that COVID time. We needed new policy around things like workplace cleaning, something as basic as making sure your labs are clean, the students that use those types of things. But it certainly added those layers of compliance around workplaces and how people engage in the workplace, social distancing and so on. But in terms of culture, it also, the culture within higher education, again, it changed pretty dramatically as a result. And we saw increased levels of stress amongst staff and students who are having to respond to the pandemic and adjust the way they go about their work. And so there were substantial changes, I think fairly seismic type changes in those three areas.
So I'm not an academic, but I've got a great interest in tertiary education. And it seems to me, as an outsider, if you like, that being a student in a tertiary institution, particularly an overseas student away from family and friends, could be quite stressful anyway. And then you overlay that with something like COVID and the ability to complete courses online and the stressors around that. But do you think the higher education sector is doing enough to support students, per se, generally speaking?
Yeah. Look, I think it's patchy, Jeremy. I think that there are some really good stories, and some of those get into the media, many don't. So I think there are good examples where there have been very good responses, necessary responses to supporting students generally, be they domestic or international. And I think universities, I think these are reputational things largely for universities in terms of how they've been able to continue to support staff and students through a time, a fairly protracted time now, of reduced student engagement on campus. And really it's a mark of how well universities have been able to pivot quickly and adapt to this new environment. So I think the answer is a mixed one. You do see good stories. I'm sure there are at least as many not so good stories. And we know that whilst there is good policy, there is good strategy and good culture, equally there is poor strategy, poor policy, and a culture that is also poor as a result. And you know, across that continuum, universities, you know, move backwards and forwards, as we know. So I think overall, universities have responded, you know, as best they can. It could always be better. I think
it is interesting. I'm interested in comparing and contrasting universities with community organisations, NGOs, in those terms. And I know in the Australian context, something like 90% of employees believe that it's important to have a mentally healthy workplace. But 50% of employees believe that their workplace isn't mentally healthy. And similarly, around 50% of employees believe their leadership, their managers, don't value mental health as highly as they do. Yeah, I think that's right. And, you know, walking the talk is so important here. It's, you know, it's one thing to have those policies. It's one thing to have some strategy, but if it's really not being implemented well in practice and people at the grassroots level, at the coalface, if that's not the lived experience, then really it just becomes words on a page. It's just rhetoric. And for the worker every day who's not receiving the support that they feel they need, then it falls short. That's the bottom line. So, Jeremy, what do you feel then is the status of well-being in workplaces generally? You've made some comments about your experience, some observations about higher education. Speaking more generally, what's your sense? Well, my sense is that many workplaces, not all of them by any stretch of the imagination, it varies from sector to sector, but many workplaces are now realising that under the legislation around workplace health and safety, psychological safety is part of that. And there are risks, as you mentioned, reputational risks, but also risks of fines, and other sanctions that might be applied should someone become severely unwell in the workplace and not be supported, or heaven forbid that the workplace has brought about an episode of poor mental health for someone.
Yes, and that happens too, as we know. It's unfortunate, but it certainly happens. And people that are online, that may be their experience, and perhaps not personally, but they perhaps have seen in their workplace. We know that, of the many participants, we've got over 60 participants currently from all around the world, and their experience may be very different from person to person, workplace to workplace. And so, our experience here at JCU or in North Queensland or indeed Australia can be very different, with different legislation in place, and those rules can be quite different regarding how people are supported. Jeremy, I want to just put to you a scenario, if that's okay. But before I do, I thought we'd just check in, Claire, just to see how that word cloud is progressing.
So you see the basic thing in there is those words which I love: empathy, respect, trust, support, inclusion, relationships, all of those wonderful things. And what that slide reminds me of is a model to look at an organisation. If you imagine a horizontal green line, above that line in an organisation, you have policies, procedures, strategies, legislation, systems and processes and IT and so on. Underneath that green line are the relationships that the staff have, the workers have, and the clients and customers with each other. So above the green line are all those things that are relatively fixed. Below the green line, you have all of those relational things which nobody seems to really entirely understand or focus on. And yet they're the things that underpin good culture.
They're the glue.
They're the glue.
Yeah.
And this is from some work that Margaret Wheaton has done about organisation culture. So above the green line and below the green line. So we've often focused on those things above the green line, getting systems, policies, procedures right, without really considering too much those relationships that everybody has in the workplace that really do, as you say, glue the organisation together.
Yeah. Very good. Well, thanks, Claire. We're going to revisit that, as I said at the end, and by all means, continue to add in your responses to that question about wellbeing. So, Jeremy, I want to just pose a scenario to you about employees taking time off work for reasons of mental health and their own wellbeing. It's been to some extent stigmatised, that notion of people taking time off, mental health days, and it can create a sense of guilt in the employee, often because they realise that their already overworked colleagues are going to have to pick up slack, if you will, while they're off work, or that work will just be piling up, and that when they return to work, it's still going to be there for them to have to address. How can these areas of policy, strategy, and culture positively impact upon a scenario like that?
Well, this is a matter that needs to be intentionally addressed by those people who are running that organisation. The leadership of the organisation needs to ensure that their strategy, their policies align with what's needed to enhance the wellbeing of their workforce. Now, they have to live those values out as well and demonstrate exactly how to do that. In addition, they must support a positive culture, a culture that is inclusive and respectful and empathic and so on. But running right through that is this idea that we're all in one workplace. We've all got a job to do in the workplace, and we do that to the best of our abilities. Now, if we find we're becoming stressed with overwork, we need a couple of things. We need to know what our workplace is offering us to support us, But we also need to know how to care for ourselves, how to recognise when we're feeling a bit stressed out, or in fact, when we're starting to really develop a mental illness or a pre-existing mental illness. Because let's face it, 1 in 4 people will develop a mental illness in their lifetime. That means 1 in 4 people in any workplace has a mental illness. It may be managed and controlled with medication or drugs or meditation, but it needs a workplace that recognises that and is supportive of not only those people, but the people who may not have a psychosocial disorder or problem, but could develop one if they're told to keep working after hours and do more with less. So it is a big issue, and it needs a really sharp focus to resolve it.
Yeah, thanks for those. So in higher education and indeed in your workplace as well, we've talked about this outside of this webinar today. There's a lot of sessional and contract staff, people on short-term contracts and casual and so on, and volunteers that are so essential to the running of most organisations, including higher education, of course. Do you think we're doing enough to support them? And if not, what do you think needs to be done to ensure that their voices are heard in these areas of policy, strategy and culture?
Yeah. So when an organisation reviews its strategy, which it should be doing on a regular basis, it needs to have a list of things about that strategy that need reviewing. It might not just be about whether we're producing enough widgets or buckets of coal or whatever. The strategy must include the workforce and the client group. So how does the strategy fit with those? And if leadership examines those, then they'll pick up on the fact that we've got volunteers working for us, we've got a casualised workforce who we don't see every day. How do we make sure we look after them? And there are ways of doing that by developing policies that include those cohorts within the overall strategy. The other thing about volunteers is that they are volunteers, but when they're volunteering for your organisation, they should be coming under the employment conditions of your organisation and the workplace health and safety requirements as well. So we shouldn't exclude anybody from any of that.
Jeremy, the pandemic I mentioned earlier, and we can't not keep talking about this given its impact upon every workplace really. It's certainly changed the structure and processes, relationships, the nature of work in virtually every organisation on the planet, including, of course, universities. What are your observations as an outsider regarding the impact of the pandemic upon university life?
Well, look, I think, as an outsider, as you say, that the pandemic has demonstrated the resilience of individuals and organisations, in most cases, through a circumstance that was thrust upon them, the pandemic, with all the connotations around that, and then government directives, which in some countries are not very much appreciated, even if it's about your own health. And I'm really heartened by the way people and organisations have risen to the occasion, have quickly got themselves organised to continue work with as little interruption as possible. And in terms of the higher education sector, I see that universities have very quickly adapted and adopted new ways of working, online tutorials, video conferencing, text messages, phone calls, all those sorts of things to connect with students. And increasingly, over time, I've seen a greater understanding and appreciation of student welfare as well as staff welfare. And those techniques, the contact, the human face, if it's not a warm body in the room, are so important for students. And in particular is the student-to-student connection. So I see there's the strength of Facebook, for example, in connecting students outside university hours to continue the conversation, to check in with each other and to identify issues or concerns that can be resolved within that setting.
Yeah, there's a lot there, as you say, and I think we're seeing, some really positive ways that universities have responded. I think there's a lot of good news out there, and universities, I think, are doing new innovative things to reach out to students in particular, to ensure that they're supported in their journey. I think those, really good news stories should be highlighted, and we're probably not doing that enough. I think to bring to the foreground those good stories that are coming out of many universities.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that the real case in point in this is the early start the Australasian Mental Health and Higher Education collaboration got on this issue. So for 4 years, I think it is, or maybe nearly 5 years, this voluntary collaboration has got together recognising this issue within higher education and is actually doing something positive about it. And that's to be congratulated.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. And that's exactly right. I think that AMHHEC, as a collaboration of a number of people, both within and outside of higher education, certainly, it's had to, we've had to go about things differently as well in terms of how we've engaged with the sector and community organisations. And of course, we welcome the input of people that are listening and colleagues into the activities of AMHHEC, such as being involved in today's webinar. Anyway, Jeremy, I'm keeping an eye on the time, but I do want to ask you, how does an organisation know when these three areas have aligned? When all the stars are lined up, we've got policy that's working, we've got strategy that's working, and we've got a culture that also is supporting that. What does that look like in an organisation?
Well, it looks like this, for me anyway. It looks like a reduction in absenteeism. It looks like more participation or better participation in workplace activities and connections. It looks like a reduction in complaints about management and organisational issues. And it looks like an organisation that has put in place all of those strategies that we've been talking about and made their staff and customer base aware of those things as well. In saying that, there are 4 key priorities that organisations need to do. First is to reduce stigma and encourage early help seeking amongst staff, and clients and customers. The second one is to enhance managers' capability and their confidence in talking about and dealing with wellbeing in the workplace. The third thing is improving the workplace factors. That is, not making people work too long, having decent breaks and so on. And the last thing is to explore better practice around how someone who has been injured psychologically in the workplace can safely return to work through a graduated return to work with appropriate supports.
Yeah, they're 4 really, really important points, Jeremy. So thank you for nicely summarising all of those and for giving us a sense of, how we can align those 3 areas and how we can sort of bring them in and make sure that the policy, strategy and culture all are working together and they are aligned, as you say. So what are some key priorities, Jeremy, you think, as we sort of come toward the end of this webinar? What would you say were some key priorities for action for organisations how can they improve health and wellbeing? What's the take-home message for people?
The take-home message is that we need to make sure that our leaders in our organisations are aware of the importance of wellbeing in the workplace, how this can increase productivity, it can decrease worker dissatisfaction. You end up with a much happier and more productive workplace. So I think leadership is critical to making this work.
Yes, I agree with you. And, you know, we desperately need leaders who can role model what Jeremy's been talking about and can really, in practical and tangible ways, demonstrate, you know, those sorts of practices within workplaces to their colleagues, to students, at every level of the organisation. So let's, Claire, let's have a look how that word cloud's developing, can we? Okay, well, you can see, as Jeremy mentioned earlier, there's a lot of those sort of almost soft skills in there, those sort of intangibles that are sort of below the line, if you will, often, but they are the glue that really connect people together in a workplace.
Yeah, so this is what management often don't see. They don't see the importance of these particular characteristics as being important in the workplace. They're more driven by what are our inputs, what are our outputs, KPIs and all of that.
Yeah.
And you can achieve all your KPIs if all of those words are included in your strategy, your policy, and your cultural discussions within the workplace.
Thanks, Claire. Now, Vicky, Dr. Vicky Hutton has been monitoring the chat, just reading off some of the comments that has come through around culture and policy. Sadly, in many workplaces, one participant is saying there's a huge difference between having policies that support staff mental health and actual practice, and that's true, isn't it? It needs to be more than just rhetoric, and there's a lot of support for those comments by that participant. A lot of people that resonated with a lot of you in relation to there being a gap between where we'd like to be and where we are currently in relation to those three areas. Another participant talks about, and Jeremy, you talked about this, about work-life balance and how we can achieve that. And particularly when in the context where you've got a manager that's fairly ruthless, possibly, and really, you know, driving staff very hard and pushing them more and more for outputs, and requiring more from them out of hours even.
Yeah, look, I noticed that attribute actually exists in the community services sector as well. But because most community services organisations know how to address issues related to that, staff feel better supported than they would in an organisation that doesn't recognise those issues as being important.
So what does that mean then? If I can just pick up on that point, what does that mean if I'm working in a community organisation and I come in as a volunteer into a higher education, and there's quite a different set of values, and how do I engage? How do I move between those two?
Well, this comes back to your values as well, and what you as an employee value. And most employees value exactly the same thing the world over. You know, a safe workplace, the ability to get on with the job, a manager who's not a bully, all of those sorts of things. So when you're moving between one workplace and another, you bring your values with you, and you'll know straight away whether your values are lining up with the organisation's values. And where they do, you'll be in a much happier place. And what I'm saying is that generally, community service organisations and NGOs generally support those positive values that you and I share, whereas other workplaces that might be more focused on profit don't necessarily do that.
And that leads me to a point about in relation to what higher education, that sector is focusing upon, and that's, of course, it's students. And so how do we instill in our students, whether they're undergraduate students or they're postgraduate students doing coursework or research, and all of that research sector, how do we also, and this is a question for reflection, I'm not expecting any answers necessarily, but how do we instill those values in our students? How can we prepare them with those values so that when they go into the workplace and they get their job or they go back to their workplace, how can they instill those values that have been learnt and developed in the higher education sector? How can they sort of translate those across into their workplace, wherever they might be? I think that's a challenge for educators. It's a challenge for the sector to be able to, through its various courses and structures, its policy, its culture, and so on, instill those values within our students, whether they be research students or doing undergraduate degrees.
Yeah, it's really about weaving the importance of those values into everything we do, whether it's lecturing or tutoring or marking or speaking with students or talking to management. Those values need to be out in the open and part of the conversation, not an afterthought. And someone once said these sort of things need to be built into systems, not bolted on afterwards.
And just there's a question about accountability and how do you factor in accountability into this process? And you've talked a lot about managers and how vital they are as really supposed to be the leaders and change agents. And so therefore, they have greater accountability, don't they?
They have greater accountability, but they've also got greater power in the organisation. And that is a blocker for people who wish to complain or express concerns about their psychological safety in the organisation. So it's about managers opening those doors. And as I said, one of those key points was building the managers and leaders' confidence and capability to talk about these things.
There's a question, and this will be our last question today. I'm just conscious of the time, but the question's a really important one about workload. And inevitably it comes up because in the higher education sector, and I'm sure in many other sectors, the issue of workload, reasonable workloads, and unions have a bit, a lot to say about this as well, and are very active in this space. But senior managers who aren't always involved in setting workloads for their subordinates, the question is, what can we do, given that workload is something that we're all having to deal with? How can we get better at managing the workload and how can we support people's, how they're coping with their workload if they seem to be really struggling?
Yeah, well, part of that answer, I think, is about advocacy. Advocating to those people who design the workloads and the system.
That takes courage.
It does, absolutely takes courage. And not everybody will stand up and say what they feel about these things. So you do have the unions advocating externally, but the most powerful advocacy tool really is about measuring success and measuring the health of the organisation and the individuals who work in it. And so those staff, client and student surveys, the 363 feedback about how people are travelling in the staff world, they're all valuable tools. But again, it comes down to the leadership being open to this and having the confidence and capability to implement those sort of strategies.
Because they're, you put out those surveys, they're risky, aren't they? And if you're putting out a survey, then you're opening yourself up to potentially negative feedback and so forth, which then needs to be addressed. And I think that, but it's such an important step around transparent accountability. What are we doing well? What aren't we doing well? And what do we need to fix? And how can we keep moving forward?
Yeah, well, a genuine leader will want to hear the negative feedback.
Yes.
They'll want to improve. And so that brings this idea of continuous improvement. Not just about continuous improvement, about how well we're doing and what outputs we're creating.
How good we are.
But how good we are.
Yeah.
It's about continuous improvement around managing people and working with people. Organisations will not survive unless their people are on board and are well enough to work.
Look, that's a fabulous note to end on, Jeremy. And so thank you for your insights and your wisdom around these issues and this topic today. I think you've raised some really excellent and important points. There's a lot of comments in the chat. I'm looking at the many comments that people have placed in the chat. I think there's lots there that people can chew over and reflect on, perhaps around their own fireside, wherever they might be. So, Jeremy, thank you.
Look, absolutely my pleasure. And thanks for the great questions and the discussion. And now it's time for a marshmallow.
Indeed. Margaret, back to you.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Jeremy. I really sincerely thank you for, I think, what's been an energising, thought-provoking and challenging conversation. And it's taken us into sometimes the elephant in the room that we are aware of, but it's that sense of can we have this conversation? And having the conversation does matter. I'd also like to thank our audience who are on the platform today. And I've absolutely been thrilled, had the privilege of engaging in the chat today, which is quite unusual for me in one of our AMHHEC webinars. And I see colleagues who've supported AMHHEC since we started in 2017. And I see colleagues who I know I have worked with in the university sector since 2012. And I see AMHHEC, who's going to be one of our keynote speakers in March, is also on the platform from James Cook University in Singapore. So thank you very much. It's fantastic to have such a great following and support because what we do and what you do matters in terms of we know that mental health and wellbeing is everybody's business. And that's why we haven't chosen to just say, oh, well, too bad, so sad, we can't have a conference. We've actually been intentional in working as a group to present. This is our third webinar for this year. We've also had a journal published, a special edition of a journal publication this year connected with AMHHEC as well. So in terms of where to from here, those of you who've registered for today's fireside chat, in the next few days, Claire does magic and you will receive the link to the recording of the fireside chat and also a survey. And the survey really informs our planning for 2022. We've got a couple of webinars and we're also in that space of additional to webinars, where do we go and what do we do and what's needed within the field, not duplicating, but making a stance on our own. Our next webinar for 2022 is scheduled on the 9th of March. And it's going to focus on something that we think is absolutely critical. And I think David and Jeremy highlighted that today in the conversation. It's the role of the professional and technical staff within higher education. In terms of we wouldn't be able to do what we do from an academic point of view, from a student point of view, unless we had the incredible contribution and the work that happens with our professional and technical staff. Many of them are behind the scenes, in fact, today for this fireside chat, and we wouldn't be where we are without their input. So we know that we wanted to prioritise that theme, and so that's the one we're going to kick off at the beginning of next year. So I would also like to acknowledge who is on the Australasian Mental Health and Higher Education Collaborative. Many of you who've journeyed with us, you'll notice that we've changed from being a conference to being called a collaboration because we're working more in this context of working with others and we're not just doing the conferences. But I'd like to acknowledge Abraham Francis, Jeremy Audas, David Lindsay, Vicky Hutton, Claire Ovasca, Simone Ross and Beryl Buckby, who have been the mainstay committee with us for several years. And without their contributions and meeting with us every fortnight, we wouldn't be where we are today. So on behalf of the Australasian Mental Health and Higher Education Collaboration, I have the privilege of wishing you all a very happy and a very safe Christmas season, and that we look forward to journeying with you through 2022. So thank you for your support. Thank you for your contribution, and enjoy the rest of the day.